Welcome back to Fantastic History. Today, I am welcoming back Martin Gray, blogger from Europe. Martin, tell the fans a little bit about yourself and what you do.
By day, I'm a journalist. I live in Scotland in the United Kingdom, just outside Edinburgh, and I love musicals, but I love comics probably more than any other form of the arts. And my favourite hero is Superman. He has been since I was a little boy. I've been reading him on and off since the 70s, mainly on. There was a couple of years around the 2000s when I was not keen, but I'm back with Superman for good, I think, till death do us part. And I'm just delighted to have a chance to have a little chat about some of the Bronze Age Superman stories that quite often they don't get talked about, they get forgotten about, but lately there's a reason to talk about them a bit more.
So, what is your favorite age of Superman?
There's something to recommend all of them. But yeah, I don't know whether it's to do with the old your favourite age of comic is when you were 12, but that would be the Bronze Age. I was born in 64, for goodness sake. And I started buying the comics when I was about 7 year old. And yeah, I think that the Bronze Age is my favourite because you had a good solid 15 years or so before the crisis with no reboots. We didn't know what a reboot was back then, or at least I didn't. I don't think it was a thing. And yeah, I love that the tale's built on the established law of the Silver Age, which I'd been able to read around about the same time because I inherited loads of Silver Age comics from a neighbour. And it just took us forward. More of Superman with his friends and foes and family. It was interesting in that it wasn't so much the tricky type stories of the 60s, so much as you get fighting bigger menaces, but you'd also get the first couple of years of the 70s, certainly was what you'll remember was called the relevance period, when the younger writers were coming on and they were really interested in engaging more with the real world, making Earth One more like our world in terms of problems. So when Superman wasn't worrying about Lex Luthor, he'd be trying to about pollution or overpopulation. You'd have the Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics where there'd be every issue would be a different social problem. And after a while, that got a little bit wearing, but for a while it was really dynamic. And then once that had worn down, had its time, you get back into a period of really great Superman comics when you had the younger writers coming on like Elliot S. Maggin, Martin Pascoe, Carrie Bates, who'd actually been around since the 60s, but he was a little bit more free to write more interesting stories, I think. And they just do stories that were a little bit more soapy, that bring back some of the older characters that they like, but that also that you'd get some of the new characters, like one of the ones, a few of the ones we can chat about today, and there'd be new supporting characters, and a lot of them have just pretty much vanished and been forgotten.
I came up with some individual characters. Let's talk about the first one we're going to talk about is Vartox. He was a champion from Valoran in the Sombrero Bucks. He only appeared about 18 times.
I remember the letter columns as being based on Sean Connery's character in the film Zardoz, which I've never seen because it looks frightening because he's standing around baring his chest and wearing basically a brown nappy. But the look works better for Vartox, I would say, as drawn by Kurt Swan. But
I no, go ahead. You're right. I am hesitant to see the movie that Sean Connery in because I really don't want to see him in that. But Vartox was only around for about, like I said, he came out in right around the mid 70s, but he also was involved with Lana as a boyfriend when she returned to Metropolis as a news anchor. Do you remember the storylines where she was actually dating?
yeah, in his first appearance, he came to Earth, because he'd lost his wife. His wife had died, and there was some convolution involving pretending that Lois Lane was dead because his wife was dead. But over the years, Lana Lang, she'd also been in Europe and she'd had a failed marriage. And in between, she'd also tried dating Clark Kent, and that hadn't gone too well after a while. So it was just so nice to see two great characters, talk to the superhero of another world and Lana Lang, get together. It stopped her being tempted to go back to mooning over Superman. Although, again, in the 70s, her character was matured quite a lot by the likes of Carrie Bates and Elliot S. Maggin, to the point whereby she realised that it was just stupid her and Lois Lane carrying on the whole time because Lois was going to win. And it was nice that she wasn't falling for Vartox's second best. He was a good man, and it was also great. Okay, it was because he was based on Sean Connery, but it was nice to see a superhero without a full head of hair for a change. Shallow, I know, but I'll take it. It was just nice that we also got to see Vortex come back in the modern age, and unlike characters like Terman who've come back in a new version, whereas Terman, who we'll get to, came back barely recognisable, Vortex.
Two more characters, which are actually created by Elliot S. Magan, appeared in Superman 260 and drawn by Kurt Swan, was the Viking from Valhalla, aka Valdemir. He had magic powers, superhero strength, and in that same issue, another minor character was called Oscar Asherman, who was a meteorologist and occasional science reporter at Galaxy Communications. Oscar was never a major character, but he did appear about 2 dozen different times. Do you remember Oscar?
Oscar was around until the mid-80s, even if it was just in crowd shots, party scenes. He'd turn up and he'd be part of the Daily Planet shenanigans, whether it would be Steve Lombard. He'd get a few lines here and there. I think there was at least once where he was at the centre of a storyline. And he was just a fun character from my childhood, and I would love to see him again.
Do you think he looked like Burt Reynolds a little bit?
I think it looks like Burt Reynolds before Burt Reynolds got better wigs, let's say.
I also reached out when we were putting this together. I reached out to, I guess I know him a friend now, Elliot S. Magan, who's also taped for the show. I asked him about these two characters. Here's what he said. Valdemar was the name of a Norse king that I put on the back of a giant eagle named Skalaric. But Oscar was based on Alan Asherman, who was at the time an assistant editor at DC. So I thought that was cool.
I remember Alan Asherman's name because he was involved with the Lois Lane comic book in the early 70s. Do you remember in about the 121 Lois Lane, she quit the Daily Planet and became a freelance reporter. And she was telling Superman, I'm not going to hang around and just moon over you. I'm a feminist freelance reporter. I'll do what I want. I'll give my best stories to the planet. But her stories became a little bit more urban, just for about 4 issues before it was all back to silly Superman nonsense. But when that happened, they had lots of letters from readers, pro and con. And for a couple of issues, they did a column, an extra letter column called The Mystery Columnist, with a picture of someone who looked to me like Oscar Ashman, actually, but with a black domino mask. And it was just really taken and being just really rude to the readers, saying, oh, women shouldn't be doing this. And the response is, Lois should get back and get a nice dress on and marry Superman. And I'd read, I don't know whether it was in Tomorrow's or somewhere else, but that was Alan Asherman writing that. But yeah, I do remember his name from the early 70s. I'd never made the link between Oscar and Alan Asherman. And I just love that you've got that out of Elliot.
And Alan went from assistant editor to becoming the keeper of the big archive room that they have at DC at the time, where all the comic books were bound up together. He had a steel trap mind for trivia like E. Nelson Bridwell did. And he just knew everything about DC Comics. Let's talk about something that nobody really knows, and that's Jonathan Ross, who was for a while there the son of Superman's longtime friend Pete Ross, who first appeared in Action Comics 457. I don't know if you remember the cover, but it has Jonathan Ross on a cover on his bed crying, not believing, about Superman. But the backstory behind Jonathan Ross was his mom had passed away when John was young. He begins to lose the will to live, and that prompted Clark Kent to reveal himself as Superman, and Jonathan Ross just would not have didn't believe him, didn't care about him. Do you remember that comic book where he was in there?
I remember, yeah. The name Jonathan Ross is funny because we've got a big star chat show host called that over in the UK who's a massive comics fan. He did a documentary on Steve Ditko. But the real comic book Jonathan Ross, I remember that because I like the irony when in that first story that Superman at that point did not know that Pete Ross knew his identity and had protected it in small for all those years after discovering it on a camping trip.
Yes, I did. I was like, this is a different take. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Pete Ross didn't tell Clark Kent that he knew his identity until Pete Ross was an adult. So he kept, isn't that correct? He kept it all the way through the teenage years and until adulthood.
What happened was in DC Comics Presents 13, Pete Ross turns up at the Daily Planet and he's trying to get Clark's attention. And I think Clark's a little bit busy. And he says, I need you now. And he just pulls open Clark's shirt and says, I know you're Superman, I need your help. And it turned out that Jonathan Ross had been kidnapped by aliens. and taken into outer space. And Superman, of course, wants to think, I'm going to go and get him back. Then the Legion of Superheroes, in one of those appearances in which they come back to the 20th century and if we know what's going to happen and you must do this, they explained that Jonathan Ross had it in their history books, had basically become the savior of a galaxy by becoming a rebel leader and killing lots of space aliens and bad races and this, that, and the other. At the end of the story, after trying various ways and even working out a way in which the galaxy could be saved without people dying, he was still convinced that Jonathan Ross, apologies, had to stay on this other world. And the story ends with Superman explaining to Pete Ross that it's terrible and he understands because he lost his planet, but his son's got to stay on this other world and it's for the good of everything. And Pete Ross obviously is incredibly distraught and angry. And the next issue is not so much about John Ross, but it's about Pete Ross going completely nutty and sort of trying to get revenge on Superman by bringing Superboy back from the past to fight him. Anyway, that's not so relevant. But a couple of years later, after so many readers had written in, a few issues after the original story, Paul Levitt, who'd written it, had to appear on the letters page and basically explain to readers that this is what had happened. The comic code were okay with a reader, with a character being kidnapped, even though the comic code rules say kidnappers can't be seen to benefit. But he says, I'm thinking of a story later on down the line, but the readers were, as I was, really peed off that this little kid had been abandoned by Superman, but with the help of the Phantom Stranger, the takeout is that Jonathan gets back to Earth. Pete Ross is able to start getting his mental health back. And the Phantom Stranger, I think, just explains that whatever will be, and they'll find another way to sort things out. Apologies if I've got the details wrong. But it was just such a weird, especially for someone like Paul Levitz, who was such a Superboy fan and had written so many great Superboy and the Legion stories, to have the Legion just appear and, if I can say, just be totally dickish towards the life of this child. I mean, the Legion at one point in the story appeared to John Ross on this world and say, we're sorry this has happened, but it's got to happen and you will be a great hero one day. It was just amazing.
So I have one more on my list, and it's Terror Man, who first appeared way back in Superman 249. He was a cowboy outlaw with advanced weaponry. He had a winged horse named Nova. He appeared for about a dozen times and he disappeared. So, do you remember that story?
He was fun because he'd actually, a little bit like John Ross, he'd been kidnapped from the Old West as a child by a space criminal who wanted to raise him as his heir. Terror Man killed the space criminal and used sort of sci-fi cowboy weapons and things to take on Superman, had this flying Pegasus. And yeah, he disappeared after about 10 years worth of appearances. Now, in post crisis, there was a Terror Man who was just not as much fun. They took the name a bit literally, and this new Terror Man was boring costume, just very utilitarian outfit. And he was an environmental scientist, so he had heart in the right place, but he was basically a supervillain. About 18 months ago, in Joshua Williamson's Superman comic book, Superman goes into the past with this fantastic character, Marilyn Moonlight. We see her origin as a tavern girl, but in the tavern, there's the original Terror Man. It turns out he'd got himself there through a time travel machine. There's been so many continuity resets, he'd probably been able to just fly through the cracks and get back there. You have a good fun rootin' tootin' battle with Terror Man. Sadly, the flying horse isn't in there, but it's referenced. And so there's every chance that the original Terror Man will appear at the end of the story. He's in a prison cell, and Superman says he's going to send back some pals to put him into a more appropriate cell or something. But hopefully, he will be back.
Martin, did we miss any minor characters that you wanted to talk about?
There were various other characters that used to pop up here and there. For example, there was Lola Barnett, who was basically post-crisis as Cat Grant, but got a lot more characterisation and storylines. There were minor characters like Percy Bratton, who was the nephew of one of the big shareholders of the Daily Planet and WGBS. As Morgan Edge used to make Clark take out stories, and he was fun. There was Meg Tempest, who was a pest in Jimmy Olsen. Honestly, we could make a case to bring any of these characters back because they all had fun at the time and have potential. But there were many great characters these days, and I think the current DC team are doing well. Joshua Williamson seems a lot more interested than a lot of writers in using supporting cast, and he's doing good, doing well. And obviously, we're going to get Mark Waid on Superboy soon, and he's good at bringing people back. So you never know who's going to pop up. No, I think the fun. I mean, I'd love to know who else other people who were reading in the Bronze Age enjoyed having, but no, thanks for letting me chat about this bunch.
This has been a fun show. Martin Gray, blogger from Scotland. Thank you for joining me today on the pod.
Thanks for having me. Cheers.